Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me here to Moscow on this beautiful summer day. So up to now I only had been here in winter, and I can tell you what a difference. It's really beautiful, and thanks that I have the possibility to give my first open air lecture. So usually if you're doing lectures about media art and media design, you are in dark spaces, but here we have the possibility to enjoy this wonderful summer. As you have heard, I'm not an architect or urban designer as you usually expect here. I'm a media artist and media designer, and I wanted to talk today about let's say a movement, a transition which we can see in our field. This is probably also important for other fields, but in our field we feel it extremely that we have the movement, a movement which is caused by the fact that we are now, since more or less 30 years, working with personal computers and have a kind of virtual communication since more than 25 years. So what we can observe is a kind of desire for the tangible, for the tactile, for the physical. And what we can observe is a kind of renaissance of the physical space and also of the tangible object. So to illustrate that movement from the... Can I do a picture? To illustrate that movement from the immaterial to the physical, from the virtual to the tangible, from the cloud back to the earth, I have selected some projects from my studio, ART+COM. And as you have just heard, we are 28 years old. We are media artists, designers, but also technicians, programmers, and hackers. And since the late 80s, we are working in this interdisciplinary tension between art, design, and digital technologies. So we are called ART+COM, and in the first, let's say, 15 years from the late 80s up to the mid of the last decade, we mainly worked, as you can expect from media designers, we worked with monitors, we worked with projections, and we also worked with big screens. So we did a lot of interactive screen-based work, a lot of projection-based work, and a lot of reactive and interactive screen-based work, large-scale installations, and so on. And as I said, 10 years ago, we then tried to bring the qualities of the digital into the physical world. So we started then working with computationally designed, physical, mechatronic-based, and kinetic objects. And this will be the main part of my talk. But before going into the physical world, I want to show at least one project from the old area, from the virtual area. And this is a stage design which we did 15 years ago. We had been invited to make a virtual stage design for an opera. And the opera is based on the libretto, The Jew of Malta from Christopher Marlowe. And in this opera, there's one person who has power over all the other ones. And we gave him the power, metaphorically, by giving him the possibility to interact with the stage. So what you see here, what you see here, he can open up, the guy on the right side can open up the stage with his arms, interactively, and if he was happy, he stopped doing that. And it was always generated newly, so he could decide in which kind of environment the whole play should take place. So we gave him different kind of interaction principles. So, and as said, we used the idea of interactivity as a metaphor for power. So I said different kind of interaction principles, so he could really move the stage and the actors in the stage. So this had been 15 years ago, and at that time there was no tracking system available with which we could track his movements. So we had to program everything from scratch. So for instance here, I'm sorry for a little bit tech talk, we detected the outline of the actor, the center of gravities, and so we could even detect the movements and the gestures of the main character. So this was the situation. I was in the orchestra, and here we had the camera tracking the person and translating these movements onto the stage. So if you start early doing things, you have to be very risky. So it was a very risky situation doing this because no one did it before, and we learned a lot about that. The second thing we did for this stage was virtual costume design. So we developed a technology which allows us to project very precisely onto the singers. And we use it to dramatize the story. So for instance, the red lady here, she has a fight with the green ones, and as soon as they agree, they get the same colors or the same textures. And as you probably can see, it only projects onto the body, so it's not going onto the rear of the stage. So therefore we had to develop also again a new system which allows us to do that. So we used the infrared camera, and with this we took 25 pictures per second. They are high contrasty. We made masks out of them, added texture to it, and then projected that picture from the camera position onto the singers. So they had been very precisely, they could move around and had always this kind of virtual costumes on. But at the end we used 4 cameras. It was much more complicated as just explained. So, but you can see that it only hits the actor, and he was free to move around and had always these virtual costumes carrying around. So this was an example from the times where we worked mainly with this kind of projection, these immaterial output interfaces. And as said, 10 years ago we then started to go and translate all this quality of the digital into the physical world. And there was one project which led us this way. This was an art commission in Tokyo in 2006. And they've been commissioned to do a work on a public sidewalk coming from the subway, and luckily there was an artificial pond directly at this public sidewalk. So it was all about, at that time, having a dialogue between the immaterial, the virtual, and the physical. So we said, okay, let's do something where we have a dialogue between light waves and water waves, between the immaterial world and the physical world. And so we created a 4x4 meter LED floor where people can walk over and create virtual ripples. And if they hit the waterfront, as you can see, they then create physical ripples. So suddenly we have this dialogue between the virtual and the physical. So this was more or less an ideal situation to discuss that. And it was quite successful. It's still running. We learned one thing for public space which was very interesting. So as you can see, it's a reactive installation. So people are walking over that and they activate something unintentionally. So compared to interactivity, where you have an intentional activation. And this creates a kind of identity, because people, they are changing the space purely through their presence. So suddenly they become part of the public space, and sometimes it also goes then into interactivity because people start playing with this. Short tech explanation to it. So we used monochrome white LEDs. We used opaque glass with weight cells, so we could measure exactly where people are walking on. With this we then created the virtual ripple, which then had been activating this kind of actuators, which then creates physical ripples. And this became a very interesting part then for us. So we said, okay, let's leave that one and go into this one. And the first purely physical the work we did was an installation for the BMW Museum in Munich. They asked us to make an installation at the very entrance. And we came up with the idea, or the proposal to say, let's do a kind of floating surface in space, which allows us to show the process of a car design. So if you have a floating surface in space, you can then show more or less any kind of surfaces. And because there are no flying carpets out there, we then started to make experiments. How can we have a hovering, floating space, shape in space? And we started with some kind of meshes or webs, and at the end we came up with spheres driven by motors. So we showed them this simulation, and then they came up and said, do you really want to show our nice car design with iron balls? And we said, yes, we want to do it. And we convinced them quite easily with doing a test setup. So we had 25 motors, as you can see, 25 spheres, which had been then driven by these motors. And we also learned a lot how to tell stories with this kind of three-dimensional physical display. But this is some kind of experience. Always do physical prototypes. This helps enormously, much more than doing some fancy visualizations. So I said we learned a lot about to tell the story, and because it was about telling the story of a car design, we picked 5 iconic cars of their history and more or less told the same story. At the very beginning, we had only white noise. There was no idea how the product, how the car will look like in the future. Then we had the very first abstract forms, which already points towards a certain car. Then we had competing forms, that's very usual in the design process. And at the very end, there was the car. In this case, a car from the 30s. So this is now a compilation of the 15-minute choreography. So it doesn't tell any story, but it shows you how the whole thing feels like. if you do new things you never did before, you always have to take risks, as said before. And I only can say out of my experience, it's always worth taking risks, because if you take risks and if you do new things, then you're really developing yourself further. But as said, you do a lot of mistakes. This is one mistake I show you here, which I don't want to experience for a second time. So it was 4 weeks before the opening, and we had the whole installation in our studio set up. And after one cycle of choreography, there was a bug. So it was a flip of signs. Instead of going up, down, they get the instruction to go up. And the problem is that up there's a ceiling, and as you will see soon, it destroyed the installation in a millisecond. So we had been 6 people here. You hear no one. We had been so shocked because we had another 4 weeks, and with a lot of interns and help from students, we then luckily could open the exhibition, and it was quite successful, became viral in the internet, and a lot of copies appeared. So suddenly the Chinese Science Museum in Beijing had this installation, the opening of the Shanghai exhibition, world exhibition, some other Chinese things. And so usually we don't copy ourselves, but we said, okay, we have to make a statement. And when we got a commission from the Singapore airport, where we had 50,000 people a day going through, we said yes, and we made a kind of similar installation with 1,200 copper drops in the entrance of Terminal 1. We had 2 installations, left and right, and this is a short impression about it. So no project without a disaster. We had been forced to make a security net under the whole installation because out of some kind of airport regulations it had to be secured, and instead it became a kind of dangerous thing because at one day a lady was jumping over onto the security net and tried to steal one of the drops. It was really dangerous because this net, security net, was not meant to hold a person. It's at least 5 meters or 6 meters. So lucky enough, I can tell you she survived. But doing this in Singapore is not fun. Okay, she made it. First I thought it's a kind of art performance, and I was in a way quite proud. But then I figured out that she has a kind of mental illness, and we actually really tried to find her address to send one of the drops, but couldn't succeed. Okay, next project out of this realm of physical installations driven by computational design and algorithms is a project for the Shanghai Expo 2010. We got a commission from a prosthesis producer, so someone who's doing all the prosthesis for legs and arms, and he wanted to donate an installation for the House of Disabled on this Expo. So we came up with the idea of communicating with a mirror and sunlight over long distances, and asked the prosthesis producer to give us 100 of hand prostheses. We then painted them white, added a mirror to it, added a motor on the rear of every hand, so the hands can move, and added a light, a very strong light source on the other side. So we have kind of moving reflections on the wall. And then we designed a computational choreography which always shows after 20 seconds the Chinese characters for movement and ability to move. So this they tested up in Germany. And you can also already see how interesting these movements of prosthesis, things you usually don't want to see, can be. So then we had to set up in Shanghai, and you can see it's a very, let's say, fragile black and white installation, because we thought it might be very interesting in a World Expo where you usually only have huge, large projections and LED screens to make something very poetic and very simple. So we are not responsible for the flowers, it's only the installation here. And you can see this computational choreography, which has this kind of behavior, swarm-like behavior, and which at the end always comes to these two Chinese characters. So we have around 100 of these choreographies. So this is how World Expo 2010 looked like. So it was all about large-scale projections, and we called it at the end a moment of retina massage. So you're walking around this expo and your retina got a very nice massage. So we purposely decided to do something more poetic and quiet and black and white, and it stood out and was not half as expensive as what you see here. So, as you have seen, we made this way from the virtual, from the immaterial to the physical, choreographed, moved by computational algorithms. Since, let's say, 5-7 years, we are working now more with pure material, computationally designed. So we are using, or we are trying to create narrative surfaces where nothing is moving, and only through the movement of the visitors the story is then told. So one project out of that is commissioned by the Deutsche Bank. They asked us to do an installation in front of their art collection and asked us to do it with their logo, which I personally like very much. And I knew Anton Stankowski who did it. He was one of my teachers, so it was a quite nice commission for me. What we did was a computationally designed mirror, a fragmented, faceted mirror, and a blue wall on the rear side. And if you're standing in the right point, you suddenly can read the logo. So it's nothing else than having a clever algorithm who is computing that surface and which then can be produced by technology, rapid prototyping, whatever. So here's the installation, you have the mirror, you have the blue light. You're coming into their headquarters, going up to their collection. You see the blue light, you see scattered triangles with no meaning, and as closer you come, suddenly the sign is legible from every side. So it's not the kind of kinetic movement anymore, it's the intelligence which is in the surface of the material. So the intelligent design process is beforehand and is decoded and deciphered by the ones who is looking at it. And we did it in a very complicated way in Korea. We had been commissioned by a museum on a river to do an installation dealing with the river. And I remembered when I got the commission, I remember the moment when I was sitting on a river and thinking, why can't this river not communicate with me with the reflections? I don't know what I smoked at that time, but I clearly remembered that moment. And I said, okay, let's create a surface, a river, which can communicate with us. So we designed a 40 square meter 3D milled silver-coated silver-coated river, or piece of a river, and with a torch you can decipher the waves. You can decipher the surface. So what we did, we it's a very complicated design, or let's say computational design process. So we encoded information in the surface which could be then decoded with a torch. So that's the principle. So we have the surface, we have a torch, and if we are walking around, we then at one moment can read a sign in the reflections. The rest is only this kind of caustic reflections that you see on the water. So we did a little test setup, as always. It's 1 square meter of a lake. And in this 1 square meter we encoded the Greek letter phi and the Greek letter delta. So phi for light and delta for movement. And as you can see, according to the position of the torch, you can then read the different kind of typography on the ceiling. So it worked, and then we were going into the content. We looked into different Korean poems dealing with river and found different attributes for river. So simply river is beautiful, or simply river is priceless. So everything we could find in a Korean poem, and computed the surface, encoded this information into the surface, 3D milled, silver coated the surface, sent our waves to Korea, set them up, and people now can, on one hand, read these two letters, which means river is, and then they take one of the torches and look to the attributes. And then they find river is eternity, or river is me, and we also have a sound with it, so it also helps people finding the right spot. So, as you can see, this was this kind of 3 phases we went through. We had this virtual area, we had this tangible area where we had moving, kinetic, choreographed installations, and now we are mainly working on these narrative surfaces, computationally designed surfaces. And 2 years ago we had our 25th anniversary and had been invited to a gallery in Berlin. It's a very nice space. They usually commission 2 artists doing a project together. And I had been paired up with Olafur Arnalds, which is a very famous Icelandic composer. And I was thinking, what can I do with him? And then it came into my mind, we had a lot of these test setups, which I was speaking about, in our studio hanging, very sadly. So they are forgotten in one or the other corner. There's one of these test setups, And the idea was to bring them back to life. So the ones you already had seen for the Korean project, and this is tested up for an installation we did for Shanghai in Saudi Arabia. The tested up the scene for BMW. Another kinetic tested up for a Deutsche Bank installation, and a prototype of a kinetic luminaire, which we did for a luminaire company in Berlin. So we renovated them, gave them another life, and then I was sitting together with the composer, and we did a 60-minute choreography, a kind of kinetic ballet, and this is the situation in the gallery. So it's some, I think 3 or 4 performances, and the rest was then as an exhibition. SAUTER. I'm a media artist. You know this guy. So, but you already see even the test setup had been loaded with kind of technology, and it was a kind of very fragile situation to renovate all of them. And this is Olafur, the composer.
Working on symphony kinetic. All about translating movement into sound, and also the other way around, that Joachim is translating my sound into movement. So it's been really interesting to write a dance piece for non-humans. The main conceptual idea about it is that each piece has its own characteristic and it has its own personality. So one piece is this piano line and another piece can be this string melody. And individually they work because they're both characters, but together they dance together, and together they become the symphony.
How people perceive it. So you see, so some of the installation had been driven by data I gave to Olafur, and other ones had been choreographed by getting his composition, and he was also playing live to one of these installations.
One of the most interesting things that I've experienced here is that this is just music for this space at this moment, and it's not meant to work anywhere else. I'm not really sure it does work anywhere else, and it's both sad and beautiful in a way that it's only for this, and it will disappear and never happen again. But in the end, it's all about these moments.
so this goes for another 60 minutes. I think it gives an impression. This, as said, was a kind of birthday present which we gave ourselves for our 25th anniversary. For our 20th anniversary, we made a book, 256 pages, English or German, and there are some copies left, so feel free. And in the book, at the end of the book, we wrote down some kind of experience we made over this 20 years and how to more or less create a sustainable, innovative environment. And I want to go quickly through some of them. Ones which I have mentioned often now in my talk is have the courage to fail. So be brave, take risks. If you don't take risks, you always do the same things you always did. Very important, be ready to say no. Don't take every commission which is given to you. Be selective and have then or create an identifiable attitude. One-liner, break rules only if you know them. Very important to know the rules, but then you can break them. And if you are at one day, if you will be a boss and leading a team, then I only can advise you never motivate people. Because if you not motivate people, they do what they think you want to do them. But you want to have the best of them. And this you only can create if you inspire them. So the other ones are also important. But for me personally, the most important thing is teaching. If you have at one moment of your career the possibility to teach, then please do it. Because teaching means that you have to be very precise in what you are doing. So you're reflecting yourself much better. If you don't ask yourself the right questions, you can't answer the questions of the students or whoever you are teaching. So I have the big privilege to teach at the University of the Art since the early 90s. I have a studio class about new media art and new media design. And for tonight I selected purposely projects from 10 years ago when we saw this transition from the immaterial to the physical. So they are old projects, but I think they show quite nicely this transition from the virtual to the physical. So one project is a very simple idea. This student, she used a bowl with water, very poetically, and if you are touching the bowl, your heartbeat is measured and stays in the water. So it's not on the heartbeat on the monitor, but it stays in the water. And you can carry the heartbeat of others around. So after a while it disappears, and but it stays in the water, so your heartbeat stays in the water. So very nice example for this translation from the immaterial to the physical. Another one was, actually the assignment had been object of desire. So the students had to create an object of desire, and the only thing they had to add was behavior. So the water was a behavior, and these students, they made a quite simple installation by only using three cylinders with three joints, a little bit of capacity sensing, and a light sensor in the head, and a clever software behind. So suddenly this object, which is nothing else than metal, very simple ones, became a kind of behavioral system. And people then started to interact with it. So one thing we learned here was that people, they really like to interact with behavioral systems because they seem to be autonomous. And it's totally different to pressing a button on a touchscreen. And they also learned that behavior creates a kind of emotional dialogue, and this is a kind of moment of security for this kind of installation. So we exhibited somewhere, you see it's so old project, the resolution is so low. We exhibited in an installation in Britain somewhere, and it survived for 1 week. And it was mainly an exhibition where young people are coming, and this is an audience which very often try hard to destroy things. But because this nice thing has created a kind of behavioral, emotional attachment, it survived. So these are the ones who usually really like to destroy exhibits. But they've been very cautiously. Oh, this guy. Okay, this goes on and on. The last project from a student, second year project from Bismarck, he made a very clever invention which could have been already done 30 years ago. He used an old camera body. Some of you probably remember, this is the one where you have this film in, and he put a film with typography in it. So it was nothing else than an exposed film with typography, and he put a flash on the rear. So by flashing through the film and through the lens, you have for milliseconds a typography on the wall which you can't read. And then he added a flash sensor to it. This is very usual in photo studios. If someone else is flashing, his flash is activating. What means, if this apparatus is standing somewhere and someone else with a flash takes a picture, this apparatus is flashing for a millisecond typography onto the wall, and you have typography in your picture without knowing where it's coming from. So, very clever thing, and he did first at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. There we have the old signs, you are entering the American sector. There's also the Russian ones near. And everyone, every tourist who took a picture of that sign had this sentence in it: 100 of people died last year by trying this at the US-Mexican border. So this is Julius. So this is apparatus, this guy is flashing, apparatus is also flashing, and suddenly there is something in the picture which no one knows where it's coming from.
Yeah. Funny you ask, because there's something on the sign that's in my picture, but it's not on the sign.
Can I see it, maybe? It's okay.
It's not possible.
You did this, or what? Voila, voila.
So he then, because this looks like a weapon, everyone was really staring at it, was a certain kind of insecurity in the area, but then he made this one which is not legible, and made some very interesting experiments with it. When Obama was visiting Berlin, it was a kind of church-like situation, and he flashed a cross onto it, and a lot of press pictures had this cross on it. No one was asking, why does have Obama a cross on the photo? And then he made a very risky thing. He went to during the Olympics, he went to Beijing and flashed Mao's stuff on Magritte's stuff onto Mao's face. So he was holding his apparatus pointing towards the picture, and if someone took a picture around him with flash, his flash was activated. So it works. Okay, it's 9 o'clock. We as Germans, we are trying to be precise. Yeah, actually it's 9 o'clock. So thank you for coming over and listening to me.